Everyone. We want to welcome you all to our Retaining Top Talent webinar series and the third and final webinar today, which is on change and stress management. These webinars are brought to you by Cornerstone OnDemand and the Partnership for Public Service, and we're really looking forward to today's conversation within the series. So for folks who might be joining us for the first time today, or as a reminder for those who have joined us before, a couple logistics. We encourage you to call into the phone line as well. We will not be able to hear you if you talk to your computer speakers. You have to dial into that phone line or use the chat box, which is in the bottom middle of your screen. There's a question that you're able to chat in the answer to now to start off today's conversation, get you used to using that chat feature, or if there's something that you want to contribute to the conversation, you can either click on the raise hand icon in the top middle of your screen or reach our operator by dialing star then 1 to put you in the queue for contributing to today's conversation. In your bottom right-hand corner, there's also a downloads pod that has a copy of today's slide, as well as an article we'll be referencing later. So those are there for your resources as well. So today's webinar, we will talk about, as a manager, strategies to manage the uncertainty in the workplace, specifically with stress and resilience with your employees. So during a time where priorities and work is changing, it's critical to manage this workflow to help improve the energy and morale of your employees. We will touch on how to manage yourself, as well as how to effectively manage others, especially during a time when energy and morale might be low. We'll hear personal experiences from current leaders on what it looks like to implement these strategies to ultimately retain your top performing talent, even during potentially stressful times. So today we have 4 fantastic panelists joining us from Cornerstone OnDemand, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Department of Health and Human Services, and the Partnership for Public Service joining in on today's conversation. Steve, do you want to start off by introducing yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Ella. I also want to take a moment to thank Partnership for Public Service for co-hosting this with us and to say thank you to our guests that are going to be joining us, Deb Schweikert, Norris Cochran, and Chris Schiavone. It's going to be a pleasure to talk to you. Although it says Cornerstone behind my name, I actually have worked for the federal government in the Treasury Department for a number of years where I was helping agencies identify talent management solutions. And also, I handled the leadership and development for the Internal Revenue Service before coming over to Cornerstone. I think this is a very important topic today. I'm really looking forward to getting into it, so I'm going to pass it on to Deb. Deb, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Deb Schweikert. I work as the Assistant Inspector General for Management at FDIC in the Inspector General's office, but I have training and HR and all sorts of fun things that report to me. I also do a lot of webinars. My specialty is probably mentoring, but I enjoy the training arena, and I've been doing it since 1992. So I'm really looking forward to this webinar.
And then Nora.
Yes, hello. My name is Norris Cochran. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Budget at the Department of Health and Human Services. I would thank all of you for this opportunity. This is a really important topic, as Steve noted. We've done some great work with the help of the partnership, and so I always look forward to an opportunity to work with them. In our line of work, we don't do webinars very often, and I'll just note that I'm not here as a representative of the department so much as just as a career executive sharing some of my own personal experiences in this area.
Thank you all. Good afternoon. My name is Chris Schiavone. I'm a Senior Manager here at the Partnership for Public Service. I'm a former government contractor, so if anybody is on from FAA or Customs and Border Protection, hi. Spent my about 8 to 10 years as a government contractor before coming to the partnership. And now I focus mainly on helping government agencies do large-scale transformation, improving employee engagement. I'm also a certified executive coach, so I do a lot of executive coaching for individuals and for teams. So without further ado, let's dive into our content today. People often talk about being stressed without actually talking about the definition behind stress. So, really when we're talking about stress this afternoon, what we're talking about is a imbalance between resources and demands. So, resources can be anything from skills. It can be anything from people, your human capital resources, to personal things like energy and time. So we're going to pose a question in the chat box, and would just love to hear from participants on what is a leading cause for stress for you right now. And we'll just give a minute for those responses to come in. Money. That is a very common stressor for people. Not enough time. That's another one that we hear frequently, and particularly personally and professionally. Uncertainty of priorities, everyone else filling in, people resources, not having enough staff. Staff funding time, work-life balance. That is certainly a big one for folks. Changing priorities. You know, these are all very typical that we hear in the work that we do with government agencies. I think it's important to realize that, you know, beyond being leaders in government, you're also human beings. So the personal stressors that you're feeling in your life, you know, as much as people are able to separate their work and personal life, those things do inherently affect you. So when we think of stress, a lot of people also think of, you know, the symptoms of stress. So, you know, for example, if you're having a heavy workload, you may be unfocused, you may be unable to prioritize. A lot of times people forget to think about the actual impact of stress. So, you know, if going back to that example, if you have a heavy workload and you're unfocused, you know, the impact of that a lot of times is your quality of work suffers. Beyond individual stressors and examples, there's also the organizational impact. So one that I often hear from people when I'm facilitating is we have too many meetings. I'm sure that is not an unsurprising complaint to all of you in government. You know, I think things like the symptoms of that is it limits the time and space that folks have to actually get work done. And then what is the actual impact of that? It can be everything from, you know, program improvements don't occur, or the right conversations aren't happening. So it's important when we talk about stress not to focus as much on the symptoms, but to actually take a minute to really think about the impact that it's having on you and your teams. An important component of stress is talking about resilience. You know, we hear this word a lot lately. And when we're talking about resilience, it's really the ability to spring back. So if you see the quote on the slide, the key to resilience is trying really hard, then stopping, recovering, and then trying again. I have a 17-month-old daughter, and she is a great example of resilience. You know, you think of little kids, and when they're trying to learn new skills, they get knocked down, they fall down, they get back up again, they try it again. And, you know, I think toddlers are a great example of resilience, and the older we get, the less resilient we get. You know, this is not to say that this is the same as optimism. Resilience really can be learned and can be practiced. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about ways that you might cultivate and improve your resilience. So if you see the picture on the screen, if you've ever taken a flight, I'm sure this will look familiar to you. And, you know, when they do the safety instructions for any flight that you're on, the one thing they tell you is when the oxygen mask drops down because of pressure change in the cabin, put your own oxygen mask on first. And when we're talking about dealing with stress, dealing with change, and trying to build capacity for resilience, it's really, really important that you focus on putting your own oxygen mask on first. If you are not taking care of yourself as an individual, as a leader, you're going to be unable to take care of others. So when we talk about building resilience, there are 4 key dimensions of personal energy that are worth noting. So the first is physical. This is how you're managing your sleep, your fitness, your nutrition, you know, finding times throughout the day to give yourself a break, rest, and renewal. You know, this can be everything from getting up from your desk and taking a lap around your office to making sure that you're eating properly, to getting in a proper amount of exercise. I'm sure anybody who has ever been on a wonderful vacation where they might have overindulged in wonderful food comes back, and your physical energy is perhaps feeling a bit low because you were not taking care of it. The same principle applies in your day-to-day. The second is emotional. So this is how you cultivate specific emotions associated with high performance. This is not to say that you need to be optimistic all of the time. Realism is actually very important, but cultivating this so you are not in this perpetual mindset of doom and gloom and automatically going to a place of, feeling like you're unable to get out of the swirl that you're in. In the mental capacity bucket, we're talking about learning to focus in an absorbed way and learning to intentionally move between the tactical and big picture thinking. This is a hard one for folks, and I think as they continue to grow in their career, this is one where we see a lot of challenge in terms of building resilience, particularly for mid-level managers and leaders, where they're still very much steeped in the day-to-day tactical responsibilities that they have, but they also need to wear a big picture strategic hat so that they are moving their teams forward, moving their organizations forward, and being able to do that in a very nimble way is a way to cultivate resilience in the mental capacity. And then fourth and lastly, we talk about spiritual. So this is, this can be whatever spirituality means to you, but really it's tapping into the energy derived from serving something larger than oneself and living a life aligned with one's values. And I would say that latter half is actually very important for folks. Spirituality looks different for different people, but how you are spending your time throughout the day and how that aligns with your personal values is where we see a lot of disconnect for people when they are struggling to build resilience. The essential element to building resilience is balance. So, trying to keep all four of these in perfect balance is certainly a challenge, but being really cognizant to realize when one of them is pretty much out of whack and you need to spend some time, addressing that, whether it's you haven't really been in a regular exercise routine or your sleep's been disrupted for a long time, you haven't really thought about your personal values in a while and how what you are spending your time on is aligned to those. Recognizing that will help you foster and improve your resilience.
So Chris, could I interject here for a second? Because one of the things that is important to recognize is if we don't get our arms around this resilience and managing the stress, you're going to burn out. And burnout causes all sorts of serious problems. It can cause you to be exhausted, be the bad apple, the negative criticism or cynicism, and it also ultimately affect your job performance and the ability to do your work. I think one of the most important things that you can start with is actually empathizing for yourself. This was a strategy by Harvard Business Review that put out an article that talked about making sure that you understand really what you're going through. What is it you're experiencing? And then asking yourself, are you creating some unnecessary stress? And is there a way for you to actually recognize that? Are you setting unrealistic expectations? Are you creating false deadlines? Are you not recognizing that there's only a certain number of hours in the day? I think it's important. It's kind of like the first step is recognizing that you have a problem or that you are in that phase and being nice to yourself and don't beat yourself up, and then start to deal with the actual stress and the barrier that you're facing. So I think the first important one for me is making sure that you're a little bit self-compassionate and you understand what you're going through and what's real and what's not real. Sorry for the interruption.
No, that is a great addition, Steve. Thank you. That is a great point. And I think one of the keys when we talk about building resilience is to recognize you're not going to get it all right all the time every single day. There are going to be days, the physical is an easy one for people in terms of nutrition and sleep and physical activity. You might not get that workout in today and you might eat Chick-fil-A for dinner. It's okay, give yourself a pass. But the larger picture is how are you doing, on the whole, and are you able to maintain some balance there? If you're finding a particular deficit in any one of these four areas, really spending some time figuring out what is happening, what is preventing you from building resilience in this area, why are you feeling drained, are there specific steps that you can take, baby steps to begin to change that behavior. So Norris and Deb, I'd love to hear from you as we talk about those 4 areas of resilience. Are there any particular areas that you have found helpful in terms of being able to be resilient in the workplace?
Well, I'm a counseling psychologist by training, and I often use the joke of I found myself in many a job where it's come in very handy because I work with crazy people, but and present organization excluded, of course. But one of the things that I like to look at is the neuroscience of all of this, and I don't think people realize how much of a distraction that stress can be. Plus, the way our brains work, we process data one way, and when we're processing, when we're looking at that 150 emails that came in today, and you're right in the middle of it, and somebody comes to your door and says, hey, I got a question, chances are you're going to say, just a minute. You snap at them. And the reason is that our brains kind of suppress the emotional side of it when they're processing data. So one of the big topics and big things we're talking about today is resilience as reflected by respect in the workplace. We've got a lot of what we have noticed to be uncivil treatment of each other, and I think part of it is that stress of processing data, and data is getting huge. We are faced with just tons and tons and tons of information every single day. So the emotional side, the social side is getting suppressed, and we're lashing out versus listening. So that's one of the things that I'm interested in studying, and I've been doing some research on, is the neuropsychology of all of this.
This is Norris Cochran. I think that's an excellent overview. One thing I would add, in addition to the importance of taking care of one's own health and one's own psyche, is sort of being a little bit analytical about what's the cause of stress. I think the slide set put out workload as kind of the demands exceeding resources as a source of stress. That is certainly a big one. The participants typed in other examples. I think things that can cause a lot of stress can be anything from changes to an employee's organization that impact the employee but are outside of the employee's control, or changes in the leadership style for the people that employee reports to, or I think one of the comments that resonated with me is having unclear roles, or changing or shifting or lack of clarity in roles and responsibilities. So I think one key point to stress management is trying to figure out what are those underlying causes, and from there trying to figure out, okay, is my diet and exercise and personal kind of reflections going to be sufficient, or are there organizational changes, process changes that are within my influence and control that should also be pursued?
Both great points, and just to add on to that, I would also recommend, folks as they're navigating through change are going to have different reactions to stress and different reactions to change. So, things that might stress you out might not be stressful to others, and vice versa. So particularly for folks who are managers and leaders, spend some time having that conversation one-on-one with your employees if you're noticing an increased amount of stress, and don't make an assumption that certain things organizationally are what's stressing them out. You'd be surprised, I think, sometimes to find out what is behind stress for folks. And the more you can probe and help them self-identify as well, will make your team stronger. So transitioning a bit, as we think about managing our resilience and our stress, there's a little equation that we like to use at the partnership, E plus R equals O, and that stands for event plus response equals outcome. So events are going to happen. We choose our response, and that results in an outcome. And while we can't necessarily control events, we certainly can control our response. And the response often has a more powerful effect on the outcome than the event. It's important to note on this that, this is cumulative over time. So think of the people that you have worked with for a long time, people you've supervised for a long time. They start to get conditioned to what your response is to certain events, and that becomes a perception of you. So as you start thinking about events that may cause you stress or be a trigger for you, try and be very cognizant about what your response is, because that is the one thing that you can control. And when you are in a state of stress or you are feeling less than resilient, oftentimes your response is probably not where you'd like it to be. So just a couple tips for effectively responding to different stressful events. The first really is pause and take a deep breath. Oftentimes people are listening to respond, not listening to understand. And give yourself permission to take a deep breath, think about what is required of you in terms of a response. If you need to step away to process, that's okay. Really breathing is very important in times of stress. Getting your mind right. When you are in that flight or fight response mode, or you are deadline driven, sometimes you are not in the right frame of mind. If you've been under stress for a long time as well, your response might not be what it should normally be. So give yourself a second, a day, whatever it may be, to really reframe the thoughts that are happening for you and figure out how you'd like to respond effectively. I'm going to jump to the last one. This is the one to me as a leadership coach that is most important when I'm working with clients, that your R is an E for somebody else. So every time that you have a response, whether that is a colleague, your boss, a mentor, a friend, your team, your response then becomes an event for somebody else. And there really is a chain reaction for how you respond to others. So just keep that in mind as you reflect on particular events where you might not have responded as you would have liked, or events where you thought, man, I really knocked that out of the park. What was the potential chain reaction of that response for somebody else? So now we're going to toss it over to Steve, and we're going to spend some time hearing a little bit more from Deb and Norris and their experience.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm very excited to turn it over to Norris and Deb to talk a little bit about how they interpreted the conversation so far. In addition to some of the things that Chris mentioned, I want to toss in some research that I was currently conducting and came across. Right now, in today's society, our actually attention span is dwindling, right? So our ability to focus in on one thing, in one research article by Deloitte issued this idea that our attention span is less than a goldfish's. I think a lot of times what we actually are experiencing is changes and advancements with technology, for example. On average, adults look at their phones 150 times a day. And that's a lot. We spend about a quarter of our time at work just doing email, whether that's filing, email, responding, or crafting. A quarter of our time is spent doing that. And so we have to find those ways to manage and decide what to pay attention to. But we also need that ability to step out and kind of, I guess my mom used to call it, find your happy space. And that's kind of a joke, but it really is. It does have some power there, that ability to think about other things, finding a low brain activity to do something like running or walking or gardening or whatever, and then just let your brain wander. Whether it's you're feeling stressed at work and you have a half hour before your next meeting, get out and walk around. That ability to get outside of it and don't rehash your worries or the issues, just find something else to think about and let your mind wander. And then come back. What we typically find with that is it helps you recharge. You might be even thinking of reconnecting some things that you wouldn't have thought of before. So it's a really effective strategy that I've used, and I've seen others use it really effectively. I guess, Norris and Deb, you talked a little bit about some strategies or the importance that you guys have. Let's talk about yourselves first, and then I want to shift to how you help your employees manage their stress. So let's talk about yourself first, and we'll go to Norris first, if you could.
Sure. I mean, I am fortunate as an individual that I have a lot outside of the workplace that provides me with fulfillment. I think one of the things that I've learned over the years, just kind of working up through my career is that while you can, in the short run, sort of starve those things outside of work, like family and friends and exercise, that if you get into the habit, while, you know, your family will forgive you for a while, over time that has a negative impact. So I think continuing to push myself to make sure that I'm keeping that balance correct and being fully present. Steve, you mentioned the phones. I think 150 times a day sounds about right, and that is a very distracting thing when you're trying to interact with friends or family. So setting some kind of barriers between work and home life so that you're continuing to invest in those things outside of the workplace that are important to you in the long run, and that also will kind of keep you stronger in the short run as well.
Great, thanks, Norris. And Deb, how about you? How do you manage yourself and your stress levels?
One of the things I've started to do, and I hate email. I think email is going to kill us all, not because there's too many of them, but in communicating in an email, you lose the emotion side of it. You can't hear the tone. You can't see the face, etc. So one of the things that I've started doing is picking a day a week where instead of sending an email to somebody, I either get up and go find them, or I call them and I talk to them. And I can't tell you how much stress that has released and relieved, because there's no misunderstanding. There's no, gee, I wonder if he's angry. I wonder if he took this the wrong way. Of course, if there's things that I need, some sort of a documented, we asked this on the state, since I'm in the IG's office, we do a lot of that kind of stuff. I'll put that in email, but in general, for the stuff I do, that has relieved an incredible amount of stress. And it also then cuts down on the number of emails I get back in response, because if you get somebody on the phone and you ask them a question, you can get the full answer versus coming back 5 times going, okay, when you said this, what else did you mean? Or I have one more question. So that's my big technique that I use. That, and also I learned way back when the relaxation response, where you tighten a muscle and then hold it for 10 seconds, relax, and you start with your toes and work up, and it just takes all the stress away. So while it does take a few minutes to do, it's at the same time, if you do it over a lunch hour, trust me, your afternoon will be much better.
So, Deb, is there any sort of barometer that you use with how much emails, 2 emails? I've heard some folks use this same technique and say 2 interactions and we call, or we visit face-to-face.
That's
is there
a pretty
general
good
rule
rule.
They use?
That's a pretty good rule, because more than that, and things are getting lost. Somewhere in the translation, things are getting lost.
Perfect. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think the back and forth, you lose the context, you don't have the emotion, and it sometimes is confusing. So I think a general rule would be 2 times and call. But you would have to apply your own barometer there to determine what your measure is. So Deb, let's stick with you for a minute and talk a little bit about how you as a supervisor, because both you and Norris are very senior in your organizations. I'm sure you've been responsible for some of the, I think Chris put it as, your R is an E for someone else. So your response is an event for someone else. So how do you help not be a stressor? How are you not a stressor to your employees? And what strategies and tips do you use to make sure that the response that you're going to get from them are the ones that you really are hoping for, both for you and also what's good for them?
Well, first I try to be the buffer from what is the source of stress for them. So if the head of the office dropping by their office really upsets them, they don't know, and these are usual positive interactions, but at the same time, the boss's boss coming by tends to put everybody on pins and needles. So I try to be the buffer. If I see my boss headed for somebody's office, I will just sort of anything I can help you with. I think the other thing is trying to end the rumors. Nature hates a vacuum and will do everything to fill it, and rumors are the filler. So whenever I have information that I think everybody's talking about but nobody knows the answer to, except maybe me or somebody else. And if I can share it, I share it to just try to de-stress and stop it. I don't think that lack of information really is a non-stressor. Actually, I think it raises everybody's antenna up, and as I said, they try to fill it in with whatever story, and it's never a good story. It's always the headline in the Inquirer. It's never something nicer. So I think information communication is critical.
Great, thanks. And Norris, how about we toss that same question to you? What sort of things do you do to help mitigate risk for your folks?
Mitigate stress. So I think there are a couple of factors that are always important. One is to treat people with kindness. It sounds obvious, but it's not always what happens, or we maybe wouldn't need a lot of these conversations. So treating people with kindness, which you could only fake it for so long. So I think part of being consistently kind to people is to get yourself in a place where you genuinely care about the individuals that you're working with, and care about your employees, so that those interactions, even the ones that are difficult conversations, that they have a foundation of kind of decency and mutual respect. In terms of kind of more specific strategies, I think it depends a lot on what the cause of the stress is. We talked a little bit about workload. If that workload is short-lived, sometimes it's just helping someone see the light at the end of the tunnel and working with them on strategies to get to the other side of a big push. If it's systemic and it's not going away, in addition to some of the strategies we talked about applying to ourselves, I think we can, where we have an opportunity to coach those that we work with to adopt similar healthy behaviors, that's certainly important to do. But I think we also owe it to our employees to be thinking about what does management and leadership need to do to fix some of these structural challenges if the problem is workload. One of the other strategies that I think can be helpful, and it's similar to what Deb described in terms of the importance of providing information, is providing perspective, not in a way that would seem to undermine or belittle the concerns that the employee is facing, because for him or her they are, of course, very, very real. But sometimes they can be helped by providing, if you're able to provide kind of a big picture about what's going on, or another way of looking at their challenge, way of helping them think about the moment that they're in the context of, having a full career, that sometimes that kind of reframing can also be helpful, I think.
Perfect. Thanks, Norris. I guess if I had to sum it up, some of the things that I heard from you and both of you in terms of helping our folks understand and manage stress is communication, making sure that they have a resource in you as the supervisor or the supervisor's supervisor, making sure that we're there for follow-up questions. We demystify some of the things, making sure that our intent is clear and the achievement of what success looks like is also clear. So a lot of very positive things on managing stress. I want to flip the ball here and go to the other part of our title, right? So this was retaining top talent, change, and stress management. We've talked quite a bit about stress management. I guess I want to talk a little bit about the other half and talk about change management, because in today's society and government today, there's a lot of change. Whether it's changing in political offices, I saw one of the questions come in a response about political appointees and things not filled, or to changing technologies and system, or this is how we're going to do it now, like changing processes. A lot of you, both of you, Norris and Deb, have been the head of some sort of change initiative, both Deb in HR and Norris, you in budget. I'm certain that programs that you've launched had to be tied with change management strategies. Can both of you kind of touch on some change initiatives that you've deployed or that went well, and maybe what to avoid if we're considering deploying something that would require change management? So Deb, why don't we start with you on this one? What sort of change management strategies have you used and found successful, and what do you carefully watch out for to avoid in change management strategies?
Well, ironically, I just read an article the other day, and I can't remember whether it was Harvard Business Review or one of the other many listservs I'm on, that stated management is change management. That's the whole job. We do change management of something just about every day. Now, in terms of big changes, I've had to deal with quite a few throughout my career. I worked in education, and I was there in the CIO's office when we went from Lotus Notes to Microsoft. And if you could see the looks on people's faces, and I thought my entire customer service team was going to be hit with pitchforks and torches because people loved their Lotus Notes. The way we counteracted that was back to information. I started on a weekly basis doing a town hall meeting with Microsoft to come in and explain their product, explain the different services, explain how things worked. The more information people had, the less threatened they were by that change. And I think that goes for just about any change you do. If they truly understand why you're trying to do it, the stress goes down. Now, what we're seeing, too, with a lot of these massive changes coming, and part of it right now, you've got a lot of uncertainty surrounding changes. Look at the furor that was going on back and forth about the possible changes in the retirement program. And people were so stressed out by it, and that's off the table for this year, but it's going to come back next year, according to all the pundits. Well, those change things do have a massive impact on people's psyche. And I think that the other thing that we've seen, the more collaboration, the more you can get people involved, the more you can get them talking to each other on the change effort, the better. The problem is, as stress goes up, empathy goes down, and collaboration plummets. So you've got to somehow, the two are very intricately intertwined. You need to manage that stress level. You need to make it manageable. Maybe that's breaking it into smaller bits. Maybe it is having weekly sessions where we just talk about what we're going to do. But I think that is the key. If people understand, I think stress goes down. It's when they don't have answers and they don't have the information and they don't see why you're doing something that stress goes up.
Great. So if I could maybe pull some themes from your conversation, your response, communication and transparency,
Yep.
And resources are really important when dealing with change.
Yep.
So Norris, how about you? Have you been involved with the change initiative? What did you deploy that made the initiative more successful, and maybe some things to avoid when dealing with change?
So I think Deb did a great job describing the importance of communication. I would just echo that even if certain facts seem what you would assume, well, everyone knows that this is going on, or that this is why we're doing it, or that this is the advantage of the change. Being explicit about that is really important, and just communicating it through multiple ways so that you're sort of removing the possibility that people don't know why, don't understand the purpose for what's going on around them. I'd say, kind of depending on the size of the change and, how big of a deal it is, it can also be important to give people the space to grieve and even vent a little bit. With change, it means not just dealing with something new, but letting go of something old, and depending again on the depth of the change and the impact that it might have on their work life, allowing them to kind of process for a little bit and talk through what they're losing is important, but then trying to steer that energy into a more productive area so we don't all kind of slip into a permanent state of negativity is important. And then when change is externally presented to us, so often we are the ones that are trying to drive the change, and it's about getting everyone on board. Sometimes change is happening to us. When change is happening to us, I think looking for the positive elements on how it might strengthen the agency or improve the mission or have organizational or resource benefits, and to not be unrealistic about that, but to look and help people kind of see where change, even when it's coming from the outside, can be helpful. And then I would say to just, for those people that are struggling to accept a change, whether it's coming from internal or externally, to really encourage them to avoid hyperbole and generalizations and encourage them to communicate in a flat and factual manner so that the conversation can be about what's actually happening and not overstatements or perceptions that might not reflect the bigger picture.
Great advice. So I want to finish out this segment and toss it back to Chris in 1 minute, but I would like to ask you one more question, and that has to do with the management of remote workforce or distributed workforce. I don't know how many of you actually have remote employees, but for example, when I was at IRS, I had a team of about 25 people, and I was there for about 2 years, and there were times when I had gone almost 2 years and had never met them face-to-face. Talk a little bit about some strategies that managers could leverage to manage or coach remote employees when they don't have the benefit of seeing them face-to-face, or I can't walk down the hall and come into your office. Any experience or advice on dealing with remote managers and employees?
I found a great tool that's free, and it seems to be available no matter where you are. We have an incredible firewall system, and I can still use it, so I don't rely on my IT team to get it for me, and it's called Zoom.com. And Zoom.com gives you a 45-minute free session, and there's no limit to the free sessions you can have. But I think that gets you about as close to face-to-face as you can. So if your remote employees have the cameras on their laptops, I think it's an excellent way that it really does seem like I'm there. I think communication is key. Don't send emails just to your staff in D.C. Send them to them as well so they understand, again, what's going on and they don't feel that they're being shortchanged. Check in frequently, but not so much that they think that you're looking over their shoulder. I think that remote workers need to feel trusted, and until they give you some reason not to trust them, that they earn that. They require that. So those are the things that I do with remote employees.
Great. And one strategy that I've used effectively is making sure that we know all the names of the individuals that are on the phone and we're addressing them throughout the conversation. Let's say we're having a town hall or a big meeting, we actually pull them into the conversation as if they're sitting right there. And I think that does a lot to remove that barrier, or at least start to mitigate it. And Norris, how about you? What sort of strategies would you recommend for coaching or managing remote employees in this instance?
I think the only two things I would add are, one, to make sure that the culture of the organization is supportive of integrating staff who are outside of the office. So, just making sure that every meeting has a dial-in, that we're mindful. In my case, I do not have employees working in a different time zone or those sorts of challenges, but, being mindful of particular challenges that may be present or differences that may be present in the physical location of employees who work outside of the headquarters area or outside of the office setting. So that would be one thing. I think the second, and Deb described the Zoom tool, is just to get as close to face-to-face as you can. And so if the resource allows employees who work remotely to come in periodically for key meetings or key planning sessions, I think that's important to kind of refresh that person-to-person bond a little bit. But where that is not feasible, even a phone call is going to be more effective than even the best worded email, because you have that, more of the ability for a conversation and for some direct connection.
Great. I guess one thing I will toss out there is at the IRS with dealing with the remote folks, what I did is I actually made sure that we had some time to talk about not work stuff, right? So it can be whatever, but if you have team meetings and you're doing remote employees, try to create the environment that allows that sort of sharing, not necessarily work-related topics, although always appropriate topics, but make sure that it works with your personality, it feels genuine to you and to your team, and create opportunities for sharing outside of work and personal, however much you feel comfortable doing. For me, for example, and my employees will probably tell you that this was a bad example, but I started each one of my meetings with a dumb joke, right? So it had to be a G-rated dumb joke, and we encourage sharing of what's going on in your life and focusing in on one employee who wants to share something about themselves in each of my team meetings. Folks probably told you that I'm the worst joke teller there is, but it's still something that kind of lessen the tension, lessen the formal nature of the meeting. So find what works for you and make sure that you allow for those opportunities to collaborate outside of work topics. And with that, I want to say thank you to Norris and to Deb. And I thought you had some really great insight, both of you. I appreciate the time. I know how hard it is to get both of your time, so I appreciate that. And I want to toss it back to Chris to perhaps close us out and ask us any questions that we might have.
Thanks so much, Steve. I would just add on to that, to the starting the conversation with a joke. In weekly check-ins that I have with my boss and that I have with my direct reports, each one of those starts with, how are you doing? And genuinely asking the question. Sometimes that takes time to build up to get a genuine response, but over time when you build that trust, that very simple question can open the door for folks to share stressors that they're experiencing, good things that are happening for them, but it really does provide a safe space if you are consistent with asking the question and not just doing it when things are going well, but asking it consistently. So just another tip. As we transition and talk about some final next steps before we turn it over to Ella to field your questions, a couple things to think about as a follow-on from today's webinar. First is to assess your energy management. So going back to that slide where we had the 4 dimensions of resilience, really take stock of where you feel like, you're doing really well, where you feel like you need to spend some time, and how that might help you both personally and in the workplace. As you revisit the E plus O equals R equation, I would encourage you to think about a recent either stressful experience or experience where you personally or your organization was undergoing a lot of change, and think about what that looked like. What was, your response? What were others' responses that then triggered your response? And what would you want to do differently or the same if it went well next time? And how might you be on the lookout for that in others? I think it's key as leaders to be looking out and observing and noticing how others are showing up, whether that's those above you in more senior positions or noticing your direct reports and what their reactions are like. And the third is a really great HBR article. If you haven't read it before, I encourage you to do so. It's called Manage Your Energy, Not Your Time. And, time came up earlier in our conversation as something that was a stressor. And I think reframing that a bit to talking about managing energy and not necessarily managing down to the minute of the day might help. There's some great tips in there. So we've used that quite frequently at the partnership, and I personally use it a lot with coaching clients. So I would recommend that you check that out. And with that, I will turn it over to Ella to field some Q&A from the group.
Perfect. And as a reminder, as Chris mentioned with the article, it is linked in the slides and also as a PDF in your downloads pod as well. So looking for something to take action on after today's webinar, maybe just a resource to talk about with your staff if you manage and lead a team of those who also supervise as well, or just kind of want to pass it along. That is a great resource. So some really wonderful conversation that happened during today's Straight from the Source section and throughout the webinar, but want to certainly make sure there's time to hear questions from the audience. So feel free to chat into the box any questions that you might have or have been lingering. Hilda, our operator on the line, do you want to open the line for questions and see if anyone has any at this time?
Thank you. As a quick reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please press *1 using your touchtone phone.
Perfect. Thank you. And something that came through the chat box before, a really good comment as one way to mitigate stress is to remember whether you're doing really well within your role or feeling run down, or same for your top talent. Breathing room really curves whether it's stress or burnout. So encouraging those that you supervise to really just take a break or take 10 minutes to kind of reset and go forward. I know this is a theme, Deb, that you touched on before, on really just kind of taking that time to press that reset button, whether it's during the day, at some point during the week, or just doing whatever you need to do to kind of reset, build that resilience, as Chris was touching on before, to be able to keep going forward. So great comment there. Certainly any comments or questions, feel free to chat those through. At this time, as we start thinking through kind of next steps, either Deb, Norris, or Steve, anything that you kind of recommend for folks to start thinking about doing right away?
There's a great book called The Physics of Emotion, and it's by Candace Pert, P-E-R-T. If you want to sort of be shocked by what stress can do to your people and to you, it's a pretty amazing book. So it sort of puts things in perspective of how critical an issue this is, and I highly recommend it.
Great.
And one final parting advice that I would offer up is making sure that you're taking time to take care of yourself, whether that's a development activity, reading a short article, reading the book that Deb just mentioned, or finding some research that you're interested in. Take some time to focus in on your own development to make sure that you can focus in on your employees when the time is appropriate. So never forget that you should be constantly improving and developing yourself. I think that also helps professionally as well as personally.
This is Norris. The only other thing I'd add is, building on Steve's point, is just to kind of take stock of your life, about what really matters most in your life, who matters most in your life, and making sure that you continue to give your 100% to your work while you are there, but that you have other things in mind as you're managing your kind of daily habits.
Great, thank you so much. It seems like some folks are chatting in the chat box, so again, feel free to type in those questions or call into the phone. Still going to switch sides, but we will take those question and answers. And Deb did chat in the name and author of that book, so if it's interesting to you, you're welcome to explore it there. So as we continue to take these questions, we encourage you to take a brief survey to give us feedback on today's webinar. We certainly want this series to be useful for folks on the line and kind of hear your thoughts, so we encourage you to take that. As a reminder, the recording will be available after the presentation to everyone who has registered, so you will be getting that in the upcoming days. But for today in the Downloads pod, you'll be able to find a copy of those slides as well as the Harvard Business Review article. Chris, having worked with many kind of managers and supervisors, what do you really recommend to folks as kind of that next step they should take as soon as they hang up the line today? Any kind of last parting wisdom you might have?
Before you return to whatever it is you're working on, see if you can sit for 2 minutes, 5 minutes. Just sit quietly without distraction. Put the phone down, don't look at the email, close your eyes if that's comfortable for you, and just take a couple deep breaths before returning to your day-to-day. I really loved the reminder from Deb, and I started wriggling up my toes when you started talking about doing the muscle relaxation and really how important that is. And oftentimes, I think we have gotten ourselves to a place where we are running from meeting to meeting, or from activity to activity, or we're shutting down work and trying to get home, get dinner on the table, and take care of our kids and all those sorts of things. And we don't actually stop, and we don't always focus on being present. So if there's one thing you can do for the remainder of the day beyond the couple minutes after this webinar is over, is I would encourage you just to be really present with whatever it is you're doing, with whoever it may be that you're speaking to. I think a lot of times we are just very, very distracted, and it is causing an inordinate amount of stress for people. And when you're able to be very present with the people that you care most about, that you're working with closely, it really does improve your relationships and can break some of that tension.
Absolutely. That's an excellent point, and I think for those who certainly manage and lead a lot of employees who are looking up, really setting that level set is important, that it's hard to give that recommendation for folks to do if you're not doing it yourself, and that's the easiest change to make, is certainly making that change within yourself to trickle down to your top talent as well. So again, just want to remind folks that question answer is open for another minute or two. If there's any last remaining thoughts, we certainly encourage you to share in that chat box as well. Any immediate actions you plan on taking from today's webinar, what really stuck with you that you're hoping to implement going forward. With the 1 or 2 minutes that we have left, either Steve or Norris or Deb, any kind of last parting words you want to ensure you leave participants with today?
I think I'd just reiterate one more time, take care of yourself first. If your employees will model exactly what you do. So if you, and you've probably seen this, if you have a boss who is the epitome of he likes to yell or he screams or he does whatever, or she, and you suddenly see people treating each other the same way. People emulate each other. So I think taking care of yourself first, getting yourself in a good place, that's going to do more for your organization and for your team than anything else.
And I think that's a great way to close the segment.
Perfect. Thank you so much, both Steve, Chris, Deb, and Norris, for joining us today. We really appreciate all of your insights and being able to share the tips for folks on the line really looking to be able to manage both of that change and stress within some of their top talent. We want to thank everyone who was participating for joining us, whether today or for the series in the Retaining Top Talent series. Again, as a reminder, you will be receiving this recording as well as a copy of the slides as a follow-up, as well as all the recordings and slides from the prior webinars as well, to make sure you have all those resources going forward. We wish you the best of luck as you retain top talent and look forward to seeing you all hopefully in the future soon.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's webinar. We thank you for participating. You may now disconnect.